A waitress secretly paid for old veterans' meal every day. What family did next left them in shock. Rachel Anderson worked the morning shift at Sunshine Diner, stretching her tips to support herself and her teenage son while taking night classes. At the local community college, each morning she watched as an elderly veteran named Jack Thompson would spend 10 minutes studying the menu, always choosing the smallest breakfast combo and counting out exact change from a worn leather coin. Purse. His military patches were pristine on his faded jacket, but his eyes carried a weight that spoke of untold sacrifices. Without a word to anyone, Rachel started leaving money at the register each day to cover his meals, even on mornings when her own gas tank was running on empty. Hi everyone, today I'm excited to share an incredible story that reminds us how a simple act of kindness can open doors we never imagined existed. Make sure to stay until the end. Trust me, you won't believe how this story unfolds. The fluorescent lights of Sunshine Diner flickered to life at 4:45 a.m. as Rachel fumbled with her keys in the back door. The early February wind cut through, her thin jacket making her wish she hadn't put off buying a warmer one. But with Alex's college applications due and the registration fees adding up, new clothes would have to wait. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee grounds and lingering. Hints of yesterday's apple pie welcomed her. Rachel moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, starting the industrial coffee makers, wiping down the chrome-edged tables, and setting out sugar dispensers that needed refilling. The quiet before the morning rush was her favorite time, when she could imagine this small corner of Milwaukee held infinite possibilities. "Morning, Rachel," called Linda, the cook, as she pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. "How'd Alex's basketball game go last night?" Rachel smiled, pride momentarily pushing aside her exhaustion. "They won by 2 points. Alex made the final shot." "That boy's going places," Linda nodded, tying her apron. "Just like his mama, working so hard with those business classes." Rachel didn't mention that she'd missed the first half of the game because her afternoon class ran late. Single motherhood was a constant juggling act, but she was determined to give Alex a better life than living paycheck to paycheck. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 6:30 a.m., right on schedule. Jack Thompson stood in the doorway, his silver hair neatly combed, military jacket brushed clean despite its wear. Rachel noticed how he gripped his cane a little tighter today. The cold always made his old wounds ache more. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Rachel called warmly. "Coffee's fresh." He made his way to his usual spot, booth 7 by the window, where morning sunlight would soon stream through the glass. Rachel watched as he pulled out his coin purse and a small notebook, already knowing what would come next. She'd seen him do this every day for the past month, carefully counting quarters and dimes, checking prices, recalculating until he found the smallest combination that would work. The first time she'd noticed him doing this, her heart had clenched. Her own father had been a veteran, proud until the end, never accepting what he called handouts. He'd passed away 5 years ago, but something in Mr. Thompson's careful dignity reminded her so much of Dad. Today, as Mr. Thompson squinted at the menu prices that had recently gone up by 50 cents, Rachel made her way to the register where Donna was counting the morning float. "Here," Rachel said quietly, sliding a $10 bill across the counter, "for Mr. Thompson's breakfast. Just tell him it's been taken care of." "Again?" Donna whispered. "Rachel, this is the 4th time this week. You've got your own bills to worry about." Rachel shook her head. "It's fine. I picked up that extra Sunday shift. Besides," she glanced at the booth where Mr. Thompson was still studying the menu. "Dad always said we need to look out for our veterans." She approached his table, notepad ready. "What can I get you this morning, Mr. Thompson?" He looked up, ice blue eyes sharp despite his age. "Just the small breakfast combo today, Rachel. Times are a bit tight until the pension comes in next week. Rachel nodded, keeping her face neutral, even as she noticed the slight tremor in his hands. The morning was unusually cold, and she wondered if his heating was working properly in that old apartment complex where many local veterans lived. "I'll get that started for you. Extra bacon today. Linda made too much," she added with a wink, knowing he'd accept what he thought was just good fortune rather than charity. As she turned to put in his order, she caught sight of Alex's college brochures peeking out of her bag behind the counter. The application fees were adding up faster than she'd expected, and her night class textbooks weren't getting any cheaper. But watching Mr. Thompson warm his hands around the coffee cup she'd just filled, she knew she'd made the right choice. What Rachel couldn't know, was that this ordinary Thursday morning would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of an entire community. Sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness create ripples that turn into waves, touching shores we never even knew existed. If this story's beginning has touched your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment below with just one word describing how helping others has impacted your life. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible journey of compassion, sacrifice, and unexpected blessings. The rhythms of Sunshine Diner were as predictable as the Wisconsin seasons. Rachel had memorized every creak in the linoleum floor, every subtle change in the morning light as it crept across the chrome-trimmed counter. Her days started in darkness, long before most of Milwaukee stirred from sleep. At 4:30 a.m., her ancient Toyota Corolla would pull into the back lot, the headlights illuminating the dumpsters where local cats sometimes sought shelter. Rachel always left a small bowl of kibble by the back door, another quiet act of kindness that had become part of her routine. "Just like feeding you strays," Linda would joke, but she too had started bringing leftover meatloaf for the cats. Inside, Rachel's morning dance began. First, the lights, not all at once, but in stages. The soft glow of the kitchen, then the counter area, and finally the dining room. The gradual awakening of the diner matched the slow brightening of the sky outside. She'd learned this routine from Carol, the previous morning manager who'd retired last year after 30 years of service. "Never blast people with brightness first thing," Carol had advised. "Let them ease into the day." The coffee makers came. Next, 3 industrial-sized brewers that were older than Rachel herself. She'd named them Faith, Hope, and Charity, though she kept that detail to herself. Faith was temperamental, requiring an extra firm press of the power button. Hope made the best dark roast, but needed its filter changed more often. Charity was the reliable one, steady and dependable, like the regulars who'd been coming to Sunshine Diner for decades. As she measured coffee grounds, Rachel checked her phone. A text from Alex lit up the screen. "Finished history paper. Left early for basketball practice. Love you." She smiled, remembering how she used to have to drag him out of bed for school. Now a senior, he'd developed his own sense of responsibility. The college applications spread across their kitchen table showed just how quickly time had passed. The prep work continued as the clock ticked toward opening time. Rachel filled sugar dispensers, checked salt and pepper shakers, and wiped down every surface until the chrome gleamed. Each table got its own small vase, artificial flowers in winter, real ones in spring when she could pick them from the small garden behind their apartment. Today's tables sported cheerful silk daisies, a splash of color against the gray February morning. "Someone's here early," Linda called from the kitchen at 5:45 a.m. The cook's arrival always filled the diner with the sense of possibility. Fresh biscuit dough, sizzling bacon, and Linda's secret recipe home fries that had customers driving from 3 towns over. "Morning, Linda," Rachel replied, already pouring a cup of coffee for her friend. "How's Tommy's cold?" Finally better. That honey and lemon tea you suggested worked wonders. Linda tied her apron, her hands moving automatically to turn on the griddle. You know, you should have been a nurse with all your home remedies. Rachel laughed. Just picking up wisdom along the way. Speaking of which, she pulled out a small bottle of liniment from her bag. For Mr. Thompson. Notice how the cold's been making his hands shake more? Linda shook her head, but her eyes were soft. Girl, you can't take care of everyone. Not everyone, Rachel corrected, tucking the bottle under the counter. Just our people. The morning proceeded with its usual parade of regulars. Frank Martinez, the postal worker, arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, ordering his usual 2 eggs over easy and whole wheat toast. He always left extra coins in the tip jar, remembering how his own mother had worked diners to put him through school. The construction crew from the new development project came in at 6:15 a.m., their yellow safety vests brightening the dim corner booths. Rachel knew each of their orders by heart. Black coffee for Mike, pancakes for Joey, and egg white omelets for health-conscious Dave.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Donna arrived for her register shift at 6:20 a.m., bringing gossip from her neighborhood and fresh concerns about her daughter's wedding planning. I told her, you can't have a beach wedding in Wisconsin in March. But does she listen? Rachel listened as she worked, her hands automatically refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, and adjusting table settings. Each customer got a smile, a kind word, and her full attention for however brief their interaction. Her father had taught her that everyone deserves to feel seen, even if just for a moment. The wall clock ticked closer to 6:30 a.m., and Rachel felt the familiar flutter in her stomach. Mr. Thompson would be arriving soon. She'd already set aside $8 from yesterday's tips, tucked safely in her apron pocket. The breakfast special had gone up to $7.95, and she wanted to make sure there was enough to cover tax. While waiting, she reviewed the day's specials. On the whiteboard, meatloaf Monday, 2 for Tuesday, Wednesday, pot pie, Thursday, Thanksgiving, Mr. Thompson's favorite, and fish fry Friday. The rotating menu was another Sunshine Diner tradition, giving regulars something to look forward to while providing the comfort of predictability. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder about tonight's business management class at the community college. Rachel had been taking night classes for the past year, squeezing in studying during slow periods at the diner and late at night after Alex was asleep. The dream of owning her own small business seemed distant, but every completed course brought it a tiny bit closer. Rachel, Donna called softly from the register, did you see the notice about the veterans' home renovation project? Rachel moved closer to the counter, where Donna held up the local newspaper. The headline announced upcoming renovations to Parkview Veterans Residence, where Mr. Thompson lived. The article mentioned necessary improvements, but Rachel read, between the lines, disrupted routines, temporary relocations, and additional stress for residents already living on fixed incomes. They're saying at least 3 months of work, Donna continued, starting next week. Where are all those folks supposed to go? Before Rachel could respond, the bell above the door chimed its familiar welcome. Mr. Thompson stood in the doorway, his silhouette familiar against the brightening sky. Rachel quickly folded the newspaper, tucking it beneath the counter. Some worries could wait. What she didn't know then was that the renovation project would become more than just another challenge. For the veterans to face, it would become the catalyst for changes none of them could have imagined, starting right here in the warm embrace of Sunshine Diner. But for now, Rachel simply reached for the coffee pot, ready to begin another morning's quiet dance of kindness, not knowing that every small gesture was building towards something extraordinary. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. A cup of coffee, a covered bill, a simple smile of welcome. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching on the chrome fixtures and creating tiny rainbows across the counter. Another day at Sunshine Diner was properly beginning, each minute holding the possibility of making someone's world a little bit brighter. Mr. Jack Thompson's presence in Sunshine Diner carried the weight of untold stories. Each morning, he would make his way to booth 7 with measured steps, his cane tapping a gentle rhythm against the linoleum floor. The silver nameplate on his jacket, Thompson Jack E., U.S. Marine Corps, caught the morning light, polished to a shine that spoke of daily care and eternal pride. Rachel had begun noticing the little details about him, the kind that most people missed. How he always aligned his silverware at perfect right angles to the table's edge. The way he would touch the American flag pin on his lapel before sitting. Down, a gesture so subtle it seemed almost unconscious. His hands, bearing the marks of time and toil, would shake slightly on colder mornings, but his movements remained precise, deliberate. "The usual, Mr. Thompson?" Rachel asked, though she already had his coffee poured, black with one sugar packet on the side. Never used, always saved in his pocket. She'd overheard him once telling another veteran that he collected them for a neighbor at Parkview who couldn't afford to buy her own. "Thank you, Rachel," he smiled, his ice blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "And please, I've told you before, call me Jack." "Mr. Thompson," she insisted warmly, maintaining the respect her father had taught her to show veterans. "The Thursday special is turkey and stuffing today. Linda made extra gravy, just the way you like it." She watched as he pulled out his small leather notebook, the same one he consulted every morning before ordering. The pages were worn soft with use, filled with careful columns of numbers. Rachel pretended not to notice how he would count out his coins under the table, arranging them by denomination before making his final decision. Today, something was different. His hands trembled more than usual as he opened the notebook, and Rachel noticed a slight wheeze in his breathing. February in Milwaukee was brutal, and she wondered if the heating in his apartment was acting up again. "Just coffee today, I think," he said finally, closing the notebook. "The appetite isn't what it used to be." Rachel's heart tightened. She'd seen this before, pride wrestling with necessity. Her own father had done the same in his final years, choosing between meals and medications while insisting everything was fine. "Actually, Mr. Thompson," she said, thinking quickly, "Linda made too much turkey this morning. It'll just go to waste if someone doesn't help us out. Would you mind? You'd be doing us a favor." The old veteran's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of understanding pass between them. He knew what she was doing, just as she knew he would normally decline. But something in her voice, or perhaps the sincerity in her concern, made him pause. "Well," he said slowly, "I wouldn't want good food to go to waste. My Catherine, she always said waste was a sin." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife's name. Rachel pulled out her notepad, but her pen hovered over the paper, waiting. "She was a wonderful cook, Catherine," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice soft with memory. "Could make a feast out of whatever we had, even when the bookstore was struggling. We had a small shop, you see, over on Madison Street, Thompson's Books and Treasures." Rachel sat down in the booth across from him, sensing a rare moment of openness. The morning rush wouldn't start for another 20 minutes, and Linda would call out if she needed help. "Owned it for 32 years, he went on, his fingers absently tracing the notebook's edges. "Catherine handled the children's section, had story time every Saturday morning. The kids would sit on this old carpet we'd bought at a yard sale, rainbow-colored, horrible thing, really. But they loved it. She'd do all the voices, you know, made every character come alive." His eyes grew distant, seeing something beyond the diner's walls. "When she got sick. Well, medical bills have a way of eating through savings, no matter how careful you've been. Had to sell the store 7 years ago. Never thought I'd miss the smell of old books so much." Rachel thought of her own dreams of business ownership, the night classes she was taking, and felt a deeper connection to the man before her. "Your store sounds wonderful, Mr. Thompson. I bet it meant a lot to the community." "It did. It did." He straightened slightly, pride returning to his voice. "My son Michael, he tried to help, wanted us to move to Boston where he lives. He's got his own chain of bookstores now, doing well for himself, but Catherine was already too sick to travel, and afterward, well, this is home. Can't imagine being anywhere else." Rachel nodded, understanding the attachment to place and community. She'd had similar offers from relatives after Alex's father passed, suggestions to move somewhere with better opportunities. But Milwaukee was home with all its challenges and memories. "Besides," Mr. Thompson added, managing a small smile, "where else would I get coffee this good?" "Coming right up," Rachel said, standing, "and I'll tell Linda to start on that turkey. Can't have her feelings hurt if we don't at least try it." As she walked to the kitchen, Rachel's mind was already working. She'd seen Mr. Thompson rub his shoulder several times, a sign the cold was affecting his old injury. The liniment she'd bought was still under the counter, but she'd need to find a way to offer it that wouldn't wound his dignity. "Order up," Linda called through the service window, "and Rachel, you might want to see this." Rachel approached the window where Linda held up the morning paper, folded to show an article about the Parkview Veterans Residence renovations. The details made her stomach sink. 3 months of work, residents needing to find temporary housing, limited relocation assistance. "They're starting next week," Linda said quietly, "right when the worst of winter hits." Rachel glanced back at Mr. Thompson, who was now gazing out the window, lost in thought. The morning sun caught the medals on his jacket, reminders of sacrifices made long ago. She thought about him trying to navigate temporary housing, dealing with disrupted routines, possibly being separated from the community he'd known for years. What she didn't know then was that this challenge would become an unexpected opportunity, not just for Mr. Thompson, but for an entire community. Sometimes, the biggest changes come disguised as problems to be solved, and the simplest acts of kindness can open doors we never knew existed. For now, though, Rachel simply wrote out his order, turkey special, extra gravy, and slipped her daily contribution to Donna at the register. One meal at a time, one day at a time. That's how her father had taught her to approach life's challenges, and so far, it hadn't steered her wrong. The Thursday morning marked the beginning of what would become Rachel's secret mission. After Mr. Thompson finished his meal and carefully counted out his payment, exact change as always, Rachel made a decision that would set unexpected events in motion. "Donna," she whispered, sliding a $10 bill across the counter. "Tomorrow, when Mr. Thompson comes in, his meal is already covered. Don't tell him who did it, okay? Just say it's been taken care of." Donna raised an eyebrow, her hand pausing over the register. "Rachel, honey, I know your heart's in the right place, but with Alex's college applications and your night classes..." "I've got it figured out," Rachel assured her, though in truth she'd been doing calculations in her head all morning. "Tuesday and Wednesday tips will cover it. Please, Donna." The next morning, Rachel watched from behind the coffee maker as Donna told Mr. Thompson his breakfast had been paid for. The mixture of surprise and dignity that crossed his face, the way his shoulders straightened ever so slightly, it reminded her so much of her father that she had to turn away for a moment. That single act grew into a carefully orchestrated routine. Every morning, Rachel would set aside a portion of her tips from the previous day, keeping track in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Some days it was easier than others. There were slow shifts when tips barely covered gas money, and unexpected expenses always seemed to pop up. One Tuesday evening, while reviewing her budget at the kitchen table after her business management class, Rachel stared at the numbers before her. Alex needed new basketball shoes. His current ones were held together with determination and duct tape. Her textbook for next semester's accounting class wouldn't be covered by her education stipend. The car was making that concerning rattle. Again. "Mom?" Alex's voice startled her from her calculations. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his practice clothes. "You okay? You've been staring at those papers for like 20 minutes. Rachel managed to smile. "Just working on a budget, sweetie. How was practice?" "Good. Coach says I might start next game." He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. "Here, I've been saving from my weekend job at the grocery store." It was $60, carefully folded. Rachel's throat tightened. "Alex, no. That's your money. Mom, I see you checking the gas gauge every morning, counting coins for coffee. Please take it." Rachel stood and hugged her son, amazed at how tall he'd grown, how adult he'd become. "You keep that money. College applications aren't going to pay for themselves, and I've got everything under control." That night, lying awake, Rachel thought about her father's words. Sometimes the richest people are the ones who give when they have the least to spare. She'd watched him share his veterans' benefits with others who had none, even in months when bill collectors called. The next morning, despite her tight budget, Rachel continued her quiet mission. She developed a system, calculating exactly what she needed each week. Monday and Tuesday tips went to savings for Alex's college applications. Wednesday tips covered her night class expenses. Thursday and Friday tips were for Mr. Thompson's meals, and weekends were for essentials and emergencies. Linda noticed, of course, the cook saw everything that happened in her diner. One morning, she silently slipped an extra piece of pie onto Mr. Thompson's plate, her own contribution to the cause. Soon, other small kindnesses appeared. Donna started forgetting to charge for extra coffee refills. Frank, the postal worker, increased his tips on days when he knew Rachel's funds might be tight. As February trudged on, Rachel noticed Mr. Thompson's increasing struggles with the cold. His cough grew worse, and some mornings his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. The upcoming renovation of Parkview Veterans Residence loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. One particularly cold morning, Rachel arrived at work to find Mr. Thompson already waiting outside the diner 30 minutes before opening. Her heart sank as she noticed him huddled in his thin jacket, breath visible in the freezing air. "Mr. Thompson," she called, hurrying to unlock the door. "You must be frozen solid. Come in, come in." As she rushed to start the coffee maker, she noticed him trying to suppress his shivering. Without a word, she went to her locker in the back and retrieved the spare sweater she kept there for emergencies. "This might help," she said, placing it on his table. "It's my dad's old cardigan. I've been meaning to donate it, but maybe you could use it." He looked at the sweater, then at her, understanding passing between them. "Your father, he was a veteran." Rachel nodded. "Marine Corps, like you, served in Desert Storm." Mr. Thompson's hand touched the sweater, fingers tracing the worn wool. "Was? Passed 5 years ago. Heart attack." Rachel busied herself with arranging sugar packets. "He used to say the cold was harder on old soldiers than anybody else. Something about the memories, he'd say." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, then carefully put on the cardigan. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time for this exact purpose. That morning, Rachel added something new to her routine. She started coming in 15 minutes earlier, making sure the diner was warm before Mr. Thompson arrived. She kept a thermos of hot coffee ready, just in case. Small gestures, but they seemed to help. The other regulars began noticing Mr. Thompson's struggles too. Frank started timing his morning deliveries to arrive when Mr. Thompson did, offering cheerful conversation and subtle assistance with the heavy diner door. The construction crew would purposefully clear the icy patches on the sidewalk before the old veteran arrived. But it was the notebook that truly caught Rachel's attention. Every morning, Mr. Thompson would make careful notes in it, tracking his expenses down to the penny. She noticed how the entries for breakfast began to include question marks, little, notes in the margin, paid for again, guardian angel. What Rachel didn't realize was that her small acts of kindness were being documented, creating a record that would soon play a crucial role in changing not just Mr. Thompson's life, but the lives of many others. Sometimes the most important stories are written in the margins of ordinary days, in the quiet spaces between coffee refills and careful calculations. As February drew to a close and the date for the Parkview renovations grew nearer, Rachel continued her quiet mission. Each morning, she would watch Mr. Thompson enjoy his breakfast, his dignity intact, unaware that he was surrounded by a community of people who had silently chosen to look after one of their own. What none of them knew was that their small acts of kindness were about to intersect with something much larger, something that would transform their quiet corner of Milwaukee in ways they could never have imagined. But for now, in the warm embrace of Sunshine Diner, they simply continued their daily dance of compassion, one meal, one morning at a time. March arrived like a lion in Milwaukee, bringing with it bitter winds and new challenges. The morning Rachel noticed Mr. Thompson's cough had worsened, she knew something had to change. His breathing seemed labored as he made his way to booth 7, and his hands trembled more than usual as he reached for his coffee cup. "The heat's been out in sections of Parkview," he admitted when Rachel asked if he was feeling all right. It was the first time he'd openly shared any difficulties with her. "They say it's related to the upcoming renovation work, something about the old systems not cooperating with the preliminary assessments." Rachel felt her concern deepen. The renovation wasn't supposed to start for another week, but already it was causing problems for the residents. She thought about Mr. Thompson spending nights in a cold apartment, too proud to complain, too independent to ask for help. "My father used to swear by this," she said, pulling out the bottle of liniment she'd been keeping under the counter. "It's nothing fancy, just something that helped with his old injuries when the weather turned bad. I bought it thinking of him, but—" She let the sentence hang there, an offer without pressure. Mr. Thompson looked at the bottle, then at Rachel. Something in his expression shifted, as if a wall had lowered slightly. "Your father," he said slowly. He understood about old wounds. "2 tours in Desert Storm," Rachel nodded, busying herself with refilling his coffee. "He used to say some scars run deeper than skin, and the cold finds them all." Mr. Thompson's eyes grew distant. "Vietnam," he said quietly, 48 years ago, but sometimes it feels like yesterday, especially on cold mornings like this." It was the first time he'd mentioned his service directly. Rachel settled into the booth across from him, sensing he needed to talk. The morning rush wouldn't start for another half hour, and Linda would cover any early customers. "Catherine," he continued, his voice soft with memory. "She always knew when the memories were bad, would wake up in the middle of the night, make chamomile tea. We'd sit in the bookstore after hours, just the two of us among all those stories. She'd read to me, poetry usually, said beautiful words could drown out the ugly memories." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. Rachel recognized a much younger Mr. Thompson in military dress uniform, standing beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and an elegant smile. They stood in front of a storefront with Thompson's Books and Treasures painted on the window in gold letters. "This was opening day," he explained. 1975. Catherine had waited for me, 4 years while I was overseas. Wrote me letters every single day. When I came back, well, I wasn't the same man who'd left. But she never gave up on me. Said we'd build something beautiful together, something that would help me remember. There was still good in the world. Rachel thought about her own dream of business ownership, her night classes, the way her father had encouraged her to never stop learning. "The bookstore must have been amazing," she said. "It was our whole world." Mr. Thompson smiled. Catherine ran the children's section, had this old rocking chair where she'd sit for story time. The local kids called her Book Grandma. Even after she got sick, she'd insist on coming in for Saturday morning readings, said the children's laughter was better medicine than anything the doctors could prescribe. He paused, his hand unconsciously going to the cardigan, her father's cardigan, that he now wore every morning. When the medical bills started piling up, selling the store was the hardest decision I ever made. 32 years of memories, all those books, all those stories. But Catherine's care had to come first. Rachel thought about her own struggles with medical bills after Alex's father passed away, how every decision became a calculation of necessity versus cost. "It must have been difficult," she said softly. "Michael, my son, he offered to help, wanted us to move to Boston, where he could look after us. He's done well for himself, has his own chain of bookstores now, but Catherine was too sick to travel, and afterward." He gestured vaguely at the diner, the street outside, the city, beyond. "This is home. Every street has a memory of her." The morning light was growing stronger now, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. Rachel could hear Linda in the kitchen, the clatter of pans signaling the start of another day. But something had shifted in the air between them, a deeper understanding taking root. "The renovation notice," Mr. Thompson said suddenly, pulling out his notebook. "They're saying we need to find temporary housing for at least 3 months. Some of the residents are moving in with family, others are taking the housing assistance to stay in motels. But He trailed off, staring at the careful columns of numbers in his notebook. Rachel saw the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. The thought of Mr. Thompson in some impersonal motel room away from his community, his routine disrupted, made her heart ache. She thought about the empty apartment above their garage, small but warm, close to the diner. But how to offer help to someone whose pride was as much a part of him as his medals? "My Catherine," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her books are still in boxes in my apartment. Been meaning to donate them, but..." He shook his head. "Silly, isn't it? Holding on to things like that." "Not silly at all," Rachel said firmly. "Some things are worth holding on to." The bell above the door chimed as the first morning customers began to arrive. Rachel stood, but Mr. Thompson caught her hand gently. "Thank you," he said, "for the liniment and for understanding about the memories." Rachel squeezed his hand briefly before moving to greet the new customers. As she worked, her mind was already turning over possibilities, trying to find a way to help that wouldn't compromise Mr. Thompson's dignity. She didn't know then that the solution would come from an unexpected direction, or that the small kindnesses, exchanged in these quiet morning hours, were building towards something much larger than any of them could imagine. For now, she simply made sure his coffee stayed hot, that his breakfast appeared without him having to check his carefully counted coins, and that he knew he wasn't alone in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Sometimes, she thought, that's where real change begins, not in grand gestures, but in small moments of connection, in shared stories and quiet understanding, in the simple act of being there when someone needs you most. The week before the Parkview renovations were set to begin, Milwaukee was hit with an unexpected late winter storm. Rachel arrived at Sunshine Diner that Thursday morning to find the streets covered in a treacherous mix of snow and ice. The pre-dawn, darkness felt heavier than usual, and the wind cut through her jacket like tiny knives. Inside, as she began her opening routine, Rachel couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Mr. Thompson hadn't missed a Thursday morning in the 3 months she'd been helping with his meals. But today, with the sidewalks glazed with ice and the temperature well below freezing, she worried. Roads are terrible, Linda commented as she came in, stamping snow from her boots. Had to leave 40 minutes early just to make it here. They're saying it's the worst storm of the season. Rachel glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m., 15 minutes until Mr. Thompson's usual arrival time. She moved to the window, wiping away condensation to peer out at the street. The city's salt trucks hadn't made it to their section of the neighborhood yet, and the sidewalks looked treacherous. "He shouldn't be out in this," she murmured, more to herself than to Linda. "Who shouldn't?" Donna asked, arriving for her. Shift with her coat pulled tight around her. Then understanding dawned on her face. "Oh, Mr. Thompson." Rachel was already reaching for her phone but stopped. She didn't have his number, had never needed it before. Their relationship existed entirely within these diner walls, in the quiet space of early mornings and shared understanding. 6:25 a.m. came and went, then 6:30. The usual morning customers trickled in, their numbers reduced by the weather. Frank arrived, looking worried. "Parkview's without heat again," he reported as he warmed his hands around his coffee cup. "Heard it from my buddy at the maintenance company. Something about the old system giving out completely this time." Rachel's concern deepened. She thought about Mr. Thompson in his apartment, possibly without heat, trying to navigate icy sidewalks just to keep his morning routine. The renovation couldn't have come at a worse time. "I'm going to check on him," she decided, already untying her apron. "Rachel, honey, you can't just leave in the middle of your shift," Donna protested, but there was understanding in her eyes. "I'll cover for her," Linda called from the kitchen. "Got some soup warming up anyway, good day for it." Rachel grabbed her car keys and the thermos she kept for emergencies, filling it with fresh coffee. She added a container of Linda's soup, some rolls, and after a moment's thought, the extra scarf she kept in her locker. The drive to Parkview took longer than usual with the treacherous roads. The building looked gloomy in the winter. Morning light, its brick facade wearing a coat of snow and ice. The parking lot was barely plowed, and Rachel had to park on the street. Inside, the building's lobby was dimly lit and noticeably cold. A handwritten sign on the elevator read, "Out of service," in bold letters. Rachel's heart sank. Mr. Thompson lived on the 4th floor. "Can I help you?" A tired-looking maintenance man appeared from a side room, carrying what looked like parts for a heating unit. "I'm looking for Jack Thompson, 4th floor?" The man's expression softened slightly. Jack. Real proud man, that one. Wouldn't take the emergency blankets we were handing out last night. Said others needed them more." Rachel's worry increased. "Is he in his apartment?" "Should be. Been telling everyone to stay put if they can, what with the ice and the elevator out. But Jack, he's got his routines. Saw him trying to head out earlier, but the steps were too icy even for the young folks." Rachel thanked him and started up the stairs, careful on the cold steps. By the 3rd floor, she was breathing hard, thinking about Mr. Thompson having to navigate these stairs every day once the renovation started. She found his apartment, 412, and knocked softly. For a long moment, there was no response. Then she heard the shuffle of feet, and the door opened to reveal Mr. Thompson, wrapped in what looked like several layers of clothing, including her father's cardigan. "Rachel?" His surprise was evident, but so was something else. Relief, maybe, or simple gratitude at seeing a familiar face. "You shouldn't have come all this way." "Brought you some coffee," she said, holding up the thermos. "And Linda's soup. She'd never forgive me if I let one of her favorite customers miss out." He hesitated for just a moment before stepping back to let her in. The apartment was neat, but cold, so cold she could see her breath. Books were everywhere, in carefully labeled boxes stacked against the walls. On a small table by the window, she spotted his leather notebook and coin purse, laid out as if he'd been preparing for his morning routine despite everything. "The heat." He started to explain, but was interrupted by a coughing fit that made Rachel's chest hurt just listening to it. "Mr. Thompson." she said gently, setting down her supplies and guiding him to sit in what appeared to be his favorite chair. "You can't stay here. Not with no heat and the elevator out." "It's temporary," he insisted, though his voice was weak. "Just until they fix the system, or until the renovation starts next week. I've got my blankets and Catherine's books." He gestured at the boxes surrounding them. Rachel looked around the apartment, really seeing it now. Every surface held memories, photographs, military medals displayed in a simple frame, a collection of bookmarks that must have been Catherine's. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a museum of a life well lived, a love story told in small objects and careful preservation. "The renovation's going to take 3 months," she said softly. "You can't climb 4 flights of stairs every day for 3 months." "The housing assistance," he began, but she could see him glance at his notebook, at the careful columns of figures that told a story of tight margins and careful planning. "I have an idea," Rachel said, pouring him some coffee in the cup she'd brought. "But I need you to hear me out completely before you say no." She told him about the apartment above her garage. "It's small," she admitted, "but it's warm, and it's only 10 minutes walk from the diner. Alex uses it sometimes as a study space, but mostly it's just sitting empty. It would be a help to me, actually, having someone there while I'm working late shifts." She saw the protest forming in his eyes and pressed on. "You'd be doing me a favor. I worry about Alex being alone so much with my schedule and having a veteran nearby. Well, it would make me feel better, and it would only be until the renovation is finished." Mr. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, looking at the boxes of Catherine's books, at the photographs on the walls. "I couldn't possibly," he started. "Think of it as helping me," Rachel said firmly. "The same way you helped the diner by being our most reliable customer. The same way you helped your community with your bookstore. Sometimes letting people help you is a way of helping them too." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the pale winter sun trying to break through the clouds. Mr. Thompson's hands were wrapped around the coffee cup, steadier now with the warmth. "Your father," he said finally, "he would have been proud of you." Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes. "He would have liked you," she said softly. "Now will you let me help, as one veteran's family to another?" What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. Sometimes the biggest changes come not from grand gestures or careful plans, but from simple moments of trust, from the courage it takes to accept help when pride would rather stand alone. But for now, in that cold apartment surrounded by boxes of beloved books and memories, 2 people who had started as strangers were discovering that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the families we choose, the connections we forge over countless cups of coffee and quiet acts of kindness. Moving Mr. Thompson into the garage apartment became a community effort that weekend. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and a sense of purpose among the Sunshine Diner's regular customers. Frank arrived with his postal van, offering to help transport the boxes of Catherine's books. The construction crew showed up on their day off, forming a human chain up the garage stairs to move furniture. Even Linda contributed, bringing enough homemade casseroles to fill the small apartment's freezer. Rachel watched from the driveway as Alex helped Mr. Thompson organize his books on the shelves they'd found at a second-hand store. Her son had taken to the elderly veteran immediately, fascinated by his stories and military history. There was something about seeing them together that made her throat tight with emotion. "Mom," Alex called from the apartment window, "Mr. Thompson's going to help me with my history project about Vietnam. Did you know he earned a Bronze Star?" Mr. Thompson looked almost embarrassed at the mention of his medal, but Rachel could see the pride in his eyes as he worked with Alex. It reminded her of how her father used to light up when sharing his military experiences with her. "The books need to be alphabetized by author," Mr. Thompson was explaining to Alex. "Catherine always insisted on proper organization. used to say a disorganized bookstore was an insult to the stories inside. The apartment, though small, had transformed over the course of the day. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the rows of books that now lined the walls. Mr. Thompson's military photographs and medals hung carefully on one wall, while Catherine's collection of bookmarks had found a home in a display case Alex had built in his woodshop class. "It's not much," Rachel said softly as she brought up another box, "but at least it's warm." Mr. Thompson turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's perfect," he said. "More than perfect. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Rachel insisted. "Having you here, it feels right somehow." Later that evening, after the last box had been moved and the last helper had gone home, Rachel sat with Mr. Thompson on the small balcony outside his new apartment. The setting sun painted the Milwaukee sky in shades of purple and gold. "Catherine would have liked this view," Mr. Thompson said, his voice gentle with memory. "She always said sunsets were like nature's storytelling hour, every color telling its own tale." Rachel smiled, thinking about her own evening classes, about the story she hoped to create one day with her own business. "Tell me more about your bookstore," she said. "What made it special?" Mr. Thompson's face lit up with remembered joy. "It wasn't just about selling books," he explained. "It was about creating a space where stories could find their readers. Catherine had this gift. She could look at a person and know exactly what book they needed, even if they didn't know it themselves." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather notebook. "We kept track of every book we sold, every reader we helped. Catherine said each sale was like matching a story with its destiny." He chuckled softly. Romantic notion, perhaps, but she believed it. Rachel noticed how his hands no longer shook when he opened the notebook. The warmth of the apartment and the security of having a safe place seemed to have steadied him already. "After she got sick," he continued, "the bookstore became our refuge. Even on her worst days, she'd insist on going in, sitting in her rocking chair, surrounded by books. Said there was more healing in stories than in any medicine." From downstairs, they could hear Alex practicing his basketball dribbling in the driveway. The familiar rhythm of the ball against concrete mixed with the evening sounds of their neighborhood. "Your son," Mr. Thompson said, "he reminds me of the young people who used to come to our store, always hungry for stories, for understanding." Catherine would have loved teaching him about books. Rachel thought about Alex's college applications spread across their kitchen table, about his dreams of studying history and journalism. "He's got a good heart," she said, "like his grandfather." "Like his mother," Mr. Thompson corrected gently. The next morning brought a return to their usual routine, but with subtle changes. Mr. Thompson still arrived at Sunshine Diner at 6:30 a.m., but now he walked with Rachel, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm as they made their way through the quiet streets. She noticed he stood straighter, breathed easier, no longer having to navigate icy stairs or cope with the cold. At the diner, the regulars welcomed him with warm greetings and subtle respect. Frank would bring him the morning paper along with stories from his postal route. The construction crew saved him the sports section, knowing he followed the local teams. Linda started experimenting with new breakfast specials, using Mr. Thompson as her unofficial taste tester. What touched Rachel most was how he continued to maintain his careful dignity. Each morning, he still took out his notebook, still counted. His coins still insisted on contributing what he could. But now there was a new entry in his notebook, rent for Rachel's apartment, carefully calculated to match what he could afford. She tried to tell him it wasn't necessary, but he was adamant. "A man needs to pay his way," he said firmly. "Even if it's not much, it matters." What neither of them knew was that this arrangement, born of necessity and kindness, was about to attract attention they never expected. The notebook Mr. Thompson kept, with its careful records of daily kindnesses and stubborn independence, would soon become the key to something extraordinary. But for now, they settled into their new routine. Each morning they would walk together to the diner, sharing the quiet moments before dawn. Mr. Thompson would tell stories about his bookstore, about Catherine's way with customers, about the thousands of books that had passed through their hands. Rachel would talk about her business classes, about her dreams of creating something meaningful, about Alex's basketball games and college plans. In the background, the renovation at Parkview continued. Other residents had scattered to temporary housing across the city, but Mr. Thompson had found something more than just a temporary shelter. He had found a new chapter in his story, one that was still being written, one word, one day, one act of kindness at a time. 2 weeks after Mr. Thompson moved into the garage apartment, Rachel noticed something different about the morning crowd at Sunshine Diner. 2 well-dressed people sat in booth 3, carrying leather briefcases and checking their phones with the practiced efficiency of business professionals. They weren't their usual type of customers. Everything from their pressed suits to their careful observations of the diner screamed out of town. "Coffee?" Rachel approached their table with her usual warm smile, though something about their presence made her slightly uneasy. "Please." The woman smiled back. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that reminded Rachel of someone she couldn't quite place. "And could you tell us when Mr. Thompson usually arrives?" Rachel's hand stilled over the coffee cups. "I'm sorry, do you know Mr. Thompson?" The man looked up from his phone, and Rachel saw the same kindness in his eyes. "We're his son and daughter-in-law," he explained, "Michael and Rebecca Thompson. We've been trying to reach him at Parkview, but when we heard about the renovation and the heating issues, we've been worried," Rebecca added. "His phone seems to be out of service, and when we called Parkview, they said he'd found other arrangements but couldn't give us details." Rachel felt her protective instincts rise. "Mr. Thompson is fine," she assured them. "He's staying somewhere safe and warm. He should be here any minute for breakfast." As if on cue, the bell above the door chimed. Mr. Thompson entered, wearing her father's cardigan and carrying a book under his arm. He'd taken to bringing one each day to share with Alex after school. He stopped short when he saw the visitors. "Michael?" His voice carried surprise and something else. Worry? Pride? Rachel couldn't quite tell. "Dad." Michael Thompson stood, crossing the diner in quick strides to embrace his father. Rebecca followed, her eyes bright with tears. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Thompson asked, his hands slightly trembling as he returned their hugs. "You should have called." "We tried, Dad," Michael explained. "Your phone's not working, and when we heard about the problems at Parkview..." He paused, taking in his father's appearance. "You look good, better than the last time we visited." Rachel began to step away, wanting to give them privacy. But Mr. Thompson caught her arm gently. "Rachel," he said, his voice warm with pride, "this is my son Michael and his wife Rebecca. Michael, Rebecca, this is Rachel Anderson. She's..." He paused, searching for the right words. "She's been looking out for me," he finished simply. The next hour unfolded like a story within a story. Rachel brought coffee and Linda's special breakfast platters while the Thompson family caught up. She tried not to hover, but she couldn't help overhearing pieces of their conversation as she worked. "The garage apartment is perfect," Mr. Thompson was saying. "Warm, close to everything I need. And Rachel's son, Alex, bright boy, interested in history. Reminds me of you at that age, Michael." "But Dad," Michael's voice was gentle but concerned, "you shouldn't have to live above someone's garage. We have plenty of room in Boston. Our house is right next to one of my bookstores. You could help out just like old times." Rachel's heart tightened as she wiped down a nearby table. She'd known this might happen. Of course, his family would want him somewhere they could watch over him properly. "Son," Mr. Thompson's voice carried that quiet dignity Rachel had come to know so well. I know you worry. But I've found something here. A community. A purpose. What purpose, Dad? Eating breakfast at a diner every morning. Rachel heard Mr. Thompson take out his leather notebook, that careful record of kindness he'd been keeping. Let me show you something, he said. As she worked, Rachel could hear him explaining about her quiet assistance with his meals, about the community that had formed around him, about Alex's interest in his stories and Linda's special breakfasts, and Frank's morning papers. She never made a fuss about it, she heard him say, just like Catherine never made a fuss about helping people find the right books. Some people just understand about dignity, about how to help without making it feel like charity. Rachel had to step into the kitchen for a moment, her eyes burning with unexpected tears. Linda took one look at her and wrapped her in a quick hug. They're going to take him to Boston, aren't they? Linda asked softly. It would make sense, Rachel managed. He should be with family. But when she returned to the dining room, something had shifted. Michael and Rebecca were looking through Mr. Thompson's notebook with growing interest. Rachel caught fragments of their conversation, something about community engagement, about authentic connections, about the kind of atmosphere they'd been trying to recreate in their own bookstores. Rachel, Michael called her over. Dad, tells me you're taking business classes? She nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Night classes at the community college, just basic business management and accounting. And you work double shifts here while raising a son alone? Rebecca's voice held admiration. All while helping others? Mr. Thompson spoke up, his voice firm. Rachel understands what Catherine always said about business, that it's not just about the bottom line, it's about creating a space where people feel valued. Michael and Rebecca exchanged a look that Rachel couldn't quite interpret. Then, Michael pulled out his business card and handed it to her. We should talk, he said, about possibilities. What Rachel didn't know, couldn't know, was that this morning would become a turning point. The notebook Mr. Thompson had kept, recording each small kindness, each careful transaction, would become evidence of something larger than any of them had imagined. Sometimes the smallest records tell the biggest stories and the most important. Investments we make aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in trust and kindness and dignity preserved. But for now, she simply poured more coffee, watched Mr. Thompson beam with pride as he showed Michael and Rebecca his new apartment, and tried not to think about the possibility of losing this unexpected family they'd created. After all, she thought some stories aren't finished even when you think you know the ending. The next morning dawned with a sense of anticipation at Sunshine Diner. Michael and Rebecca Thompson had asked to meet with Rachel during her afternoon break, and she found herself checking the clock more often than usual. Mr. Thompson seemed particularly cheerful as he sat in his usual booth, sharing knowing glances with Linda whenever Rachel passed by. Stop worrying, Linda told her as she picked up another order. Whatever they want to discuss, it's got your biggest fan in a good mood. She nodded toward Mr. Thompson, who was showing Alex old photographs during the boys' before-school breakfast visit. That's what worries me, Rachel admitted quietly. What if they're just being kind before telling me they're taking him to Boston? The morning rush kept her too busy to dwell on her concerns. She moved through her familiar routine, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, making sure every customer felt welcomed. But her mind kept returning to Michael's business card, which seemed to burn in her apron pocket. At precisely 2:30 p.m., during the afternoon lull, Michael and Rebecca returned to the diner. This time, they carried a leather portfolio along with their briefcases. Mr. Thompson was still in his usual booth, having stayed through lunch, something he'd never done before. Rachel, Michael called warmly, would you join us? Dad's been telling us more about your business classes. Rachel untied her apron, grateful that the diner was nearly empty. Linda appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, then tactfully retreated to the kitchen, Though Rachel noticed, she stayed within earshot. "We've been looking over Dad's notebook," Michael began once they were settled. "It's quite remarkable, really. Not just the record of your kindness, but the way you handled it, preserving his dignity, creating a system that worked within both your means." Rachel felt her cheeks warm. "It wasn't anything special, just trying to help the way others. Help my father. But that's exactly what makes it special," Rebecca interjected, opening the portfolio. "You understand something that we've been trying to recreate in our bookstores for years, the sense of community that Mom and Dad's original store had." Michael nodded. "We've expanded to 12 locations across New England," he explained. "Good locations, strong sales, but something's been missing, that personal touch, that sense of belonging." Mr. Thompson spoke up from his seat. "Tell her about the Milwaukee project, son." Michael spread several documents across the table. Property listings, market analyses, demographic studies. "We've been planning to expand into the Midwest," he explained. "Milwaukee's been on our radar for a while, but we've been struggling with the right approach. This area especially has a strong independent bookstore history, but also a real need for community spaces." Rachel looked at the papers, her business class training kicking in as she recognized various financial projections and market assessments. "These are all within a few miles of here," she noted. "The renovation project at Parkview got us thinking," Rebecca continued. "This whole area is going through changes, new development, but also a lot of long-time residents who don't want to lose their community's character. It's exactly the kind of neighborhood where Mom and Dad's store thrived. We've been interviewing potential managers for months," Michael added. "People with retail experience, business degrees from top schools. But after seeing Dad's notebook, after hearing about how you've created this sense of community here at the diner," he exchanged a glance with Rebecca, "well, we started thinking differently about what qualities really matter." Rachel's heart was pounding. "I don't understand." "We'd like you to manage our new Milwaukee location," Michael said simply. "Not just manage, we want you to help us design it, create the kind of space that bridges old and new, that makes everyone feel welcome, just like you've done here." Mr. Thompson reached across the table and placed his notebook in front of Rachel. "Show them your drawings," he said gently. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the sketches she'd made during her business classes. Floor plans for her dream cafe bookstore with cozy reading corners, a children's area, space for community events. She'd never shown them to anyone except Alex. "These are exactly the kind of ideas we've been looking for," Rebecca said warmly. "A space that's about more than just selling books. It's about creating connections." "But I don't have enough experience," Rachel protested. "I'm still taking basic business classes." "You have the most important kind of experience," Michael countered. "Dad showed us how you manage your budget, how you've created systems to help others while running your own household and pursuing your education. That's the kind of practical business sense we need. Besides," Rebecca smiled, "we're offering full training, health benefits, and—" she named a salary that made Rachel's breath catch. "Plus support for continuing education. We believe in investing in our people." Mr. Thompson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It would be like coming full circle," he said softly. "A new bookstore, but with the same heart the old one had." "And," Michael added, watching his father, "we've been thinking about incorporating a veterans outreach program. Maybe partner with Parkview once the renovation is complete. Create a space where service members can gather, share stories." Rachel looked around the diner, at Linda pretending not to eavesdrop from the kitchen, at the empty booth where Alex did his homework every afternoon, at Mr. Thompson's proud smile. "This is overwhelming," she managed. "Take some time to think about it," Rebecca assured her. "We'll leave all the information with you, but there's one more thing." She pulled out another document. We noticed the building next to your house is for sale. The one with the empty storefront downstairs and apartments above?" Rachel nodded. She'd passed that building every day, sometimes allowing herself to dream about having her own business there someday. "We think it would be perfect," Michael said. "Close to home for you, near enough to Parkview for Dad to stay involved, plenty of parking for community events. We'd handle the purchase and renovation, but we'd want your input on every detail." The afternoon sun streamed through the diner windows, catching on the chrome fixtures and creating patterns across the documents spread before her. Rachel thought about all the mornings she'd spent here, serving coffee and kindness in equal measure, never imagining where it might lead. What she didn't know then was that this conversation was just the beginning. The notebook that had started as a simple record of quiet kindness would become the blueprint for something that would transform not just her life, but an entire community. But for now, she simply looked at Mr. Thompson, saw the hope in his eyes, and allowed herself to begin dreaming bigger than she ever had before. Sometimes, she realized, the best opportunities come not from careful planning, but from the simple act of doing what's right, one day at a time. That evening, after her shift ended, Rachel sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the documents Michael and Rebecca had left. Alex was at basketball practice, and she could hear Mr. Thompson moving around in the garage apartment above. The soft thud of books being reorganized, a comforting backdrop to her thoughts. The numbers on the papers before her were more than she'd ever imagined possible. Not just the salary, but the comprehensive benefits package, the continuing education support, the opportunity to be part of something that could change their entire community. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the preliminary floor plans for the proposed bookstore. A gentle knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Thompson stood there, holding 2 cups of tea. "Catherine always said important decisions were better made with a cup of tea," he said, setting one in front of her. "Mind if I join you?" Rachel welcomed him with a grateful smile. "I could use some wisdom right now." Mr. Thompson settled into the chair across from her, his eyes taking in the spread of papers. "You know," he said carefully, "when Catherine and I opened our first store, we had no idea what we were doing. Just a dream and a lot of determination." "But this is different," Rachel protested. "This is such a huge responsibility. Michael and Rebecca's investment, their trust." "What if I'm not ready?" Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather notebook. "May I show you something?" He opened it to the first page, where dates and amounts were carefully recorded. "When you started helping with my meals, I kept track, because that's what I've always done, tracking every penny, every kindness. But as time went on, I started noticing something else." He turned the pages slowly, revealing not just financial records, but small observations. Rachel remembered Linda's soup helps with cold days. Alex stayed late to hear about Vietnam. Community gathering for moving day, everyone helping. You created something here," he continued, his voice soft with emotion. "Not just help for an old veteran, but a web of connections, of people looking out for each other. That's what Catherine and I tried to do with our bookstore. It was never just about selling books. It was about creating a space where people felt they belonged." Rachel sipped her tea, thinking about all the mornings at Sunshine Diner, all the small moments that had led to this opportunity. "I'm afraid of letting everyone down," she admitted. "Let me tell you something about fear," Mr. Thompson said, touching the military medals that he now kept on a small shelf in the kitchen. "When I came back from Vietnam, I was terrified of everything. Crowds, loud noises, even success. Catherine was the one who showed me that fear doesn't have to stop you. It just means you care enough to want to do things right." From upstairs came the sound of Alex returning home, dropping his basketball gear with a thud. Moments later, He bounded down to the kitchen, still energized from practice. "Mom," he exclaimed, then noticed the papers on the table. "Are those the bookstore plans? Mr. Thompson was telling me about it. Can we really have a whole section for history books and maybe a study area for students?" Rachel felt her heart warm at her son's enthusiasm. "We haven't decided anything yet, sweetheart." "But Mom, it's perfect." Alex pulled out a chair, his eyes bright with excitement. "I could help after school and Mr. Thompson could run the veterans section and you wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said softly. Rachel looked at her son, then at Mr. Thompson, then at the plans spread before her. The proposed location was perfect, close enough that she could walk to work, with the upper floors providing potential housing for veterans during the extended Parkview renovation. The community room could host events, study groups, veterans meetings. Michael and Rebecca said they'd provide full training, she said slowly, more to herself than the others. "And I could finish my business degree with their support." "And you already know how to run things," Alex added earnestly. "You manage our whole house, plus help everyone at the diner, plus your classes. Mr. Thompson says you're just like his Catherine, always knowing what people need." Mr. Thompson's eyes misted at this. "He's right, you know. You have the same gift she had, seeing beyond what people say to what they really need. That's not something you can learn in business school." Rachel stood and walked to the window. The empty storefront next door seemed to glow in the evening light, its possibilities suddenly vivid in her mind. She could almost see it. Warm lighting, comfortable chairs, shelves of books waiting to find their readers, a place where veterans could gather, where students could study, where community could grow. The renovation would take about 3 months, she said thoughtfully, same as the Parkview project. We could coordinate, maybe even provide temporary space for some of the residents during construction. "Now you're thinking like a business owner," Mr. Thompson smiled. Catherine would have loved that, turning one challenge into an opportunity to help others. Alex was practically bouncing with excitement. "Does this mean we're doing it? Mom, please say we're doing it." Rachel turned back to the table, to these two people who had become such an important part of her life. "It's a big risk," she said carefully. "Life's full of risks," Mr. Thompson replied. "The trick is knowing which ones are worth taking." She picked up Michael's business card, then looked at Mr. Thompson's notebook. That simple record of kindness that had somehow led to this moment. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest opportunities come disguised as small gestures, and the most important investments we make are in people, not things. "I'll need help," she said finally. "Both of you. This would be a family project." "Family," Mr. Thompson repeated softly, touching the notebook. "Yes, that's exactly what this is about." What none of them knew then was that this decision would ripple out far beyond their small kitchen, beyond their neighborhood, beyond even their hopes for the future. The bookstore would become something more than just a business. It would become a blueprint for how community could be built, one story, one connection, one act of kindness at a time. But for now, in that warm kitchen with the sound of evening settling around them, they simply began to dream together. Alex grabbed paper to start listing his ideas for the student section. Mr. Thompson began talking about veteran outreach programs, and Rachel felt something settle in her heart. The certainty that comes not from having all the answers, but from knowing you're on the right path, surrounded by the right people. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Rachel's morning routine at Sunshine Diner now included meetings with contractors, calls with Michael and Rebecca, and endless lists of decisions to be made. The empty storefront next door had become the center of their neighborhood's attention, with locals pressing their faces against the dusty windows, curious about the activity inside. "You sure about the reading nook in the front window?" The contractor Dave asked one morning as they stood in the empty space. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, creating patterns on the worn wooden floor. Most businesses want to maximize shelf space. Rachel smiled, remembering Mr. Thompson's stories about Catherine's window seat in their old store. Sometimes the most valuable space isn't about selling books, she replied. It's about creating moments. The renovation plans were ambitious but thoughtful. The main floor would house the bookstore, with carefully curated sections flowing into one another. The children's area would feature a low ceiling with twinkling lights, creating a magical reading cave. The history and veterans section, which Mr. Thompson would oversee, would have comfortable chairs and space for small group discussions. Upstairs, the apartments were being converted into temporary housing units for Parkview residents during their building's renovation. Michael and Rebecca had embraced the idea enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to immediately impact the community. But with progress came challenges. One morning, Rachel arrived at the diner to find Mr. Thompson already there, looking troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked, pouring his coffee. "Got the official notice from Parkview this morning," he said, pulling out a letter. "They're starting the major work next week. Some of the residents, they're struggling to find temporary places they can afford." Rachel sat down across from him, her mind already working on solutions. "How many?" 5, maybe 6. "Proud folks like me. Don't want to take charity, but the housing assistance barely covers half of what most places are charging." The bell above the door chimed as Linda arrived for her shift. She took one look at their serious faces and joined them. "What are we plotting?" "The upstairs apartments won't be ready for at least 3 more weeks, Rachel said slowly. "But maybe." She thought about the community that had formed around them, the construction crew that worked on the building during their off hours, the local furniture store owner who'd offered discounted furnishings, the art students from the community college who'd volunteered to paint murals. "Linda," she said suddenly, "doesn't your sister run that small motel on Oak Street?" Linda's eyes lit up with understanding. "The Golden Pine? Sure does. Been struggling since they built that new hotel downtown. What if we could work something out? A guaranteed block of rooms for 3 weeks, paid in advance." Rachel pulled out her phone to text Michael and Rebecca. Mr. Thompson watched her with pride. "Just like Catherine," he said softly, "always finding ways to turn one good thing into another." The next few days became an exercise in community coordination. Michael and Rebecca approved the motel plan immediately, seeing it as an investment in community goodwill. Linda's sister offered a deeply discounted rate, grateful for the guaranteed income. The construction crew volunteered to help transport residents' essential belongings. But it was the evening meeting at Sunshine Diner that truly showed the power of community. Rachel had kept the diner open late, setting up chairs in a circle. Veterans from Parkview sat alongside local business owners, students, and families. "The bookstore isn't just my dream," Rachel explained to the gathered group. "It's meant to be a space for all of us. During the transition, we need to look out for each other." People began offering what they could. A retired teacher volunteered to coordinate a tutoring program for students. A local chef offered to teach cooking classes for veterans living alone. Alex and his basketball teammates promised to help with heavy lifting and organizing. Mr. Thompson sat beside Rachel, his notebook open, recording not just offers of help, but moments of connection. A veteran connecting with a high school student interested in military history. A lonely widow offering to read to children. Small bridges being built across generations and circumstances. Later that night, as Rachel and Mr. Thompson walked home, he said quietly, "You know what Catherine would say about all this?" "What's that?" "She always said a good bookstore is like a garden. You plant seeds of possibility and nurture them with care. But the real magic happens when the community starts growing things you never expected." Rachel looked at the building that would soon become their new chapter. Light from the street lamps caught on the fresh paint samples they'd tested on the window frame. Warm colors chosen to make everyone feel welcome. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "There's so much to coordinate, so many people counting on this. Working." "Good," Mr. Thompson smiled. "Catherine said the best dreams should terrify us a little. Means we're aiming high enough." The next morning brought new challenges. The contractor discovered issues with the building's wiring that would add to the timeline and budget. 2 more Parkview residents needed temporary housing. Rachel's business class had a major project due. But something had shifted in how she faced these challenges. Each morning at the diner, she watched her community come together. Construction, workers sharing coffee with veterans, students helping elderly customers with their phones, Linda experimenting with new recipes for the future cafe section of the bookstore. "Mom," Alex said one evening as they reviewed paint samples at the kitchen table, "remember when you used to worry about making ends meet?" Rachel looked up, surprised. "We still have to be careful with money, sweetie." "Yeah, but it's different now. Before it was just us trying to figure everything out. Now it's like we have this whole big family helping." From upstairs came the sound of Mr. Thompson moving books. He'd started sorting through Catherine's collection, deciding which ones would help start the store's inventory. Each book had a story, he'd told them. Not just the one printed on its pages, but the one about how it had found its way to their shelves. What none of them knew then was that their project was about to attract attention far beyond their neighborhood. The story of a waitress helping a veteran, leading to a community coming together to build something special, would soon travel further than they could imagine. But for now, Rachel simply added another item to her endless to-do list, drew a star, next to community meeting, book donation drive, and allowed herself to feel the quiet joy of watching a dream take shape, one small detail at a time. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps, and the most important buildings are built not just with bricks and mortar, but with hope, determination, and the collective strength of a community that believes in something bigger than themselves. The story of Sunshine Diner and the upcoming bookstore began to spread beyond their neighborhood in unexpected ways. It started with a small article in the local newspaper, a human interest piece about a waitress helping a veteran, leading to a community transformation. But something about the story struck a chord with readers. One morning, Rachel arrived at the diner to find a news van parked outside. Her first instinct was to slip in through the back door, but Mr. Thompson was already there, wearing her father's cardigan and looking surprisingly comfortable talking to a reporter. "The real story," she overheard him saying, "isn't about one person helping another. It's about how small acts of kindness can grow into something bigger than ourselves." The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, seemed genuinely moved by Mr. Thompson's words. When she noticed Rachel approaching, her eyes lit up. "Ms. Anderson, would you tell us more about how this all started?" Rachel felt her cheeks warm. "It's really not that remarkable," she began. But Mr. Thompson interrupted, gently. "Show her the notebook," he suggested. "Sometimes the simplest records tell the most important stories." With trembling hands, Rachel accepted the leather notebook he offered. Together, they sat in booth 7, their usual spot, and showed Sarah the careful entries that had started with simple breakfast payments and grown into something more. "See here," Mr. Thompson pointed out, where she started planning the community outreach programs. And these margins, notes about what different people in the neighborhood might need or be able to contribute. It's like watching a garden grow. On paper. Sarah leaned forward, genuinely interested. "And now you're converting the apartments above the bookstore into temporary veterans housing?" "It just made sense," Rachel explained, warming to the conversation. "Why have empty space when people need help? And having veterans involved in the bookstore project from the beginning, it makes it more than just a business. It makes it a community." The story aired that evening on the local news. Rachel watched it with Alex and Mr. Thompson in their living room, all three of them a bit overwhelmed by seeing their daily life presented as something special. "But it is special, Mom," Alex insisted. "Look how many people are already being helped, and the store isn't even open yet." The next morning brought a surprise. Michael called early, his voice excited. "Have you checked your email?" The story got picked up by national news outlets. People are calling it a blueprint for community-based business development. Rachel hadn't checked her email. She'd been too busy coordinating with Linda's sister about additional rooms needed at the Golden Pine Motel for Parkview residents. But when she finally looked, her inbox was overflowing. There were messages from other business owners asking about their model for community integration. Veterans organizations wanted to know more about their housing program. Local schools inquired about future partnerships for their reading programs. "It's overwhelming," she admitted to Mr. Thompson during their morning coffee. "I'm not sure how to handle all this attention." He smiled, reminding her so much of her father in that moment. Catherine used to say that when something grows bigger than you expected, it's because it needed to. The world was waiting for it. The attention brought unexpected benefits. Local businesses, inspired by the story, began offering support. A painting company volunteered to help with the bookstore's exterior. A tech company offered to set up a computer center for job searches and veterans services. A local coffee roaster wanted to supply the cafe. But more meaningful were the personal responses. Veterans from other cities wrote to share their own stories of struggling to find community after service. Single parents reached out about how Rachel's story gave them hope. Small business owners asked about incorporating community service into their models. "We've started something here," Michael said during one of his frequent video calls, "something that could be replicated in other communities. Would you be willing to help us develop a framework for future projects?" Rachel looked around the diner, at Linda experimenting with new recipes for the bookstore cafe, at Alex tutoring younger students in his usual booth, at Mr. Thompson sharing stories with other veterans who now made Sunshine Diner their morning gathering place. "I'll help," she said slowly, "but we need to keep it authentic. This worked because it grew organically, from real needs and real connections." The contractor called that afternoon with news about the bookstore renovation. "We're ahead of schedule," Dave reported. "The community volunteers have made a huge difference. Never seen anything like it. Retired electricians helping with wiring, art students designing murals, everyone pitching in." That evening, Rachel sat with Mr. Thompson on the small balcony of his garage apartment, watching the sunset paint, the sky in shades of hope. Below them, Alex was organizing donated books with several of his basketball teammates. "I've been thinking," Mr. Thompson said, pulling out his notebook, "about what made Catherine's story times so special. It wasn't just the books she chose. It was how she made everyone feel part of the story." Rachel nodded, understanding where he was going. "You think we should share our story more deliberately? Use it to help other communities?" "Every good book needs a sequel," he smiled, "and every good idea needs room to grow." What they didn't realize then was that their story was about to inspire a movement. The simple act of a waitress helping a veteran, recorded in a leather notebook and nurtured by a community's love, would become a catalyst for change far beyond their corner of Milwaukee. But for now, they focused on the immediate needs: finishing the renovation, coordinating temporary housing, planning the grand opening. Rachel kept Mr. Thompson's notebook close, still recording daily acts of kindness, still planning ways to help others, still believing in the power of small gestures to create big changes. "You know what Dad would say about all this?" she asked Mr. Thompson as they watched Alex and his friends below. "What's that?" "He always said that the measure of a person isn't in what they have, but in what they share. I think he and Catherine would have gotten along well. Mr. Thompson's eyes misted slightly. They're seeing it, he said softly. Somewhere, they're seeing all of this, and they're proud of what their lessons helped create. The evening settled. Around them, bringing with it the sounds of community. Children playing in nearby yards, neighbors greeting each other, the distant thud of basketball on concrete. In the growing dusk, the bookstore's newly painted exterior glowed warmly, a beacon of possibility in their changing neighborhood. Sometimes, Rachel thought, the biggest dreams start with the smallest gestures, and the most important stories are the ones we write together, one page, one day, one act of kindness at a time. With 1 week until the grand opening, the transformation of the old storefront was nearly complete. The morning sun streamed through newly cleaned windows, catching on freshly painted shelves and gleaming wood floors. Rachel stood in the center of what would soon be Thompson's Corner Books and Cafe, taking in every detail. The name had been Michael's suggestion, a tribute to his parents' original store. When he'd proposed it, Mr. Thompson had turned away. Quickly, but Rachel had caught the shine of tears in his eyes. "Mom!" Alex's voice echoed through the empty space as he bounded down the stairs from the apartments above. "Mrs. Martinez finished the murals in the children's section. You have to come see." Rachel followed her son upstairs, where local artist Elena Martinez was putting the finishing touches on a magical woodland scene that wrapped around the children's reading nook. Trees seemed to grow right out of the walls, their branches creating cozy reading caves, while painted animals peeked out from behind carefully placed bookshelves. "It reminds me of Catherine's reading corner," Mr. Thompson said softly. He'd appeared beside them so quietly, Rachel hadn't heard him approach. She would have loved this. The children's section had become a labor of love for the entire community. Local woodworkers had crafted small chairs and reading tables. Alex's basketball team had spent a weekend painting and assembling kid-sized bookshelves. Even Linda had contributed, creating a special menu of child-friendly snacks for the cafe. The first shipment of books arrives this afternoon. Rachel checked her phone, where her to-do list seemed to grow longer every day. And the veterans' housing units upstairs are ready for the first residents to move in tomorrow. The upstairs apartments had evolved into something more than just temporary housing. Each unit had been carefully furnished with donations from the community. Comfortable chairs, warm blankets, small touches that made them feel like homes rather than temporary spaces. Local art students had painted each door with a different nature scene, turning the hallway into a gallery. "Speaking of books," Mr. Thompson pulled out his notebook, "I've been thinking about the veterans section. Catherine always said the right book at the right time could be medicine for the soul." Together, they walked to the area that would become the military history and veterans resources section. Unlike the bright colors of the children's area, this space was designed with warm, calming tones. Comfortable leather chairs, donated by a local furniture store, created intimate reading nooks. A small meeting room off to the side would host veterans support groups and writing workshops. "I've been in touch with some of the authors who wrote to us after the news story," Mr. Thompson explained. "Several have offered to donate signed copies of their books about military experiences and recovery. And that therapist who specializes in veterans issues, she's willing to do monthly sessions here." Rachel watched as he ran his hand along one of the empty shelves, already seeing in his mind how it would look filled with books and possibilities. His presence in the store had become essential, not just for his knowledge of books, but for the way he connected with other veterans, understanding their unspoken needs. The bell above the door chimed. They'd installed it just yesterday, its sound a familiar comfort from Sunshine Diner. Linda entered, carrying several bags that filled the space with the aroma of fresh baking. "Testing the final cafe menu," she announced, setting up her samples on the counter. Thought we could use a break from all this organizing. As they gathered around the counter, Rachel marveled at how her diner family had embraced this new venture. Linda had taken charge of designing the cafe menu, creating special items named after regular customers. There was the Thompson's tea, time special, tea with homemade scones, just like Catherine used to enjoy. The Veterans Victory was a hearty breakfast sandwich that had already become legendary during their test runs. The newspaper wants to do another feature, Rachel mentioned as they sampled Linda's baking. About how the project has grown, about the community involvement. Tell them about the scholarship fund, Alex said through a mouthful of muffin. He'd been particularly proud of this initiative. A portion of the store's proceeds would go toward college scholarships for local students and veterans' families. The idea had come from one of their community meetings. A local teacher had mentioned how many talented students couldn't afford college application fees, let alone tuition. The conversation had reminded Rachel of her own struggles with Alex's college applications, and the solution had seemed obvious. Michael and Rebecca doubled the initial funding, Rachel added. They said it fits perfectly with their vision of sustainable community impact. The afternoon brought more activity. The first delivery of books arrived. Boxes upon boxes of carefully curated titles. Rachel had worked with Michael and Rebecca to ensure the selection reflected their community's needs and interests. There were books in multiple languages, representing their neighborhood's diversity. The local history section would feature works by Milwaukee authors. As they began unpacking, more helpers arrived. Frank from the post office brought his teenage daughters to help sort books. The construction crew, officially finished with their work, showed up anyway to help with heavy lifting. Even Donna from the diner came by during her break, bringing coffee for everyone. Mr. Thompson supervised the organization with careful attention to detail, his notebook now full of diagrams showing exactly where each genre should be placed. Catherine always said the flow of a bookstore was like a conversation, he explained. Each section should lead naturally to the next, inviting readers to explore. As evening approached, Rachel stood at the front window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of promise. The window seat, built to match the one from Mr. Thompson's description of Catherine's store, was already her favorite spot. From here, she could see Sunshine Diner across the street, its lights warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. "Penny for your thoughts?" Mr. Thompson joined her, offering a cup of tea. "Just thinking about how it all started," she said softly. "One breakfast, one small decision to help. One person recognizing another's dignity," he added, "just like Catherine would have done." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their community move around them. Through the window, they could see Alex and his friends putting up the grand opening banners. Linda was still in the cafe area, arranging things just so. The first group of veterans would move into the upstairs apartments tomorrow, bringing new life to the building. What they didn't know then was that their grand opening would exceed everyone's expectations, not just in terms of sales, but in the connections it would create, the lives it would touch, the stories that would begin within these walls. But for now, they simply sat together, a waitress and a veteran who had become family, watching their shared dream take final shape around them. Sometimes, Rachel thought, the most beautiful stories are the ones we never see coming, the ones that start with a simple act of kindness and grow into something that changes not just our lives, but the lives of an entire community. The morning of the grand opening dawned clear and bright, as if even the weather was celebrating with them. Rachel arrived at Thompson's Corner Books and Cafe at 5:30 a.m., her old diner routine serving her well. The store wouldn't open until 9, but there was so much to perfect. To her surprise, she wasn't the first one there. Mr. Thompson was already inside, straightening books that were already perfectly aligned. He wore a new suit, a gift from Michael with her father's cardigan over it, and his military medals gleamed on his lapel. Couldn't sleep, he admitted when she came in. Keep thinking about Catherine, about how proud she would be of all this. The store was transformed from the empty shell it had been just months ago. Wooden shelves gleamed under warm lighting, books arranged with loving care. The children's section upstairs glowed with Eleanor's murals, while the veterans' corner provided a dignified, welcoming space. The cafe area, under Linda's expertise, was ready with fresh pastries and the rich aroma of coffee. By 6:30 a.m., others began arriving. Linda came to set up the cafe, insisting on making breakfast for everyone. Alex and his basketball teammates showed up in matching t-shirts they'd designed, Thompson's corner crew printed across the back. Even Frank arrived early, before his postal route, to help with last-minute details. There's already a line forming outside, Donna reported when she stopped by before her diner shift. Sure enough, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the balloons and banners announcing the grand opening. At 8:45, Michael and Rebecca arrived with their children, completing their family circle. Rachel watched as Michael hugged his father, saw the pride and love pass between them. Rebecca had brought something special: Catherine's old reading chair from their original store, carefully restored as a surprise. When Mr. Thompson saw it, he stood perfectly still for a long moment. "How did you?" he began. "We found it in storage," Michael explained. "Thought it belonged here in the new story corner." As 9 a.m. approached, Rachel gathered everyone in the center of the store. Looking at the faces around her, her son, Mr. Thompson, her diner family, the community that had made this possible, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Before we open these doors," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I want to thank you all. This isn't just a bookstore. It's a testament to what happens when people believe in each other." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his notebook in hand. "In here," he said, holding it up, "I've recorded every act of kindness that led to this moment. From that first breakfast Rachel covered, to every person who helped make this dream real. Catherine always said books are like mirrors. They show us who we are. This store is a mirror too, reflecting the heart of our community." At exactly 9 a.m., Rachel unlocked the doors. The crowd that poured in exceeded their expectations. Families with children raced upstairs to the reading nook. Veterans gathered in their dedicated corner, sharing stories and coffee. Students claimed study spaces, while book lovers browsed the carefully curated shelves. The local news crew was back, capturing the moment for their follow-up story. Sarah Chen, the reporter who'd first shared their story, interviewed people throughout the day, collecting testimonials about community impact. "Look at this," she said to Rachel during a quiet moment. "It's more than just a business opening. It's like watching a community come together." Indeed, throughout the day, Rachel witnessed countless moments of connection. A veteran helping, a young student find books for a history project, a retired teacher offering to start a reading group, local authors inquiring about holding workshops. Each interaction proved that they'd created something far beyond a simple bookstore. The upstairs apartments had welcomed their first residents, 3 veterans from Parkview who would help manage different aspects of the store's community programs. Mr. Thompson had taken them under his wing, showing them how to organize books, teaching them the importance of creating a welcoming space. By afternoon, Linda's cafe had run out of pastries twice, leading to an impromptu baking session that filled the store with homey aromas. Alex and his friends ran a continuous story time in the children's section, taking turns reading to an ever-changing audience of excited kids. The day's most touching moment came when an elderly woman approached Mr. Thompson, clutching a well-worn book. "I used to visit your original store," she said softly. "Catherine helped me find this book when I was going through a hard time. I've kept it all these years." Mr. Thompson looked at the book, then at the woman, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Mrs. Parker," he said. Catherine always said this was one of her most important matches, finding the right book for the right moment. Rachel watched as they talked, sharing memories of the old store, of Catherine's gift for connecting. People with stories. In that moment, she understood even more deeply what they'd created. Not just a new business, but a bridge between past and present, between memories and new beginnings. The evening brought a special moment. As the crowd thinned, Michael gathered everyone in the center of the store. "We have an announcement," he said, gesturing to Rebecca, who held a large envelope. "What we've seen here," Rebecca continued, "is exactly what we've been trying to create in all our stores. This combination of business and community, of profit and purpose. We want to use this as a model." She opened the envelope, revealing plans for similar community-integrated bookstores in other cities. "And we want Rachel to help develop the program, to show others how to recreate this magic in their own communities." Rachel felt her heart skip. The opportunity was enormous, a chance to help other communities create their own versions of what they'd built here. But looking at her family gathered around her, Alex beaming with pride, Mr. Thompson nodding in approval, Linda and Donna sending encouraging smiles, she knew she wouldn't have to do it alone. As the sun set on their first day, Rachel and Mr. Thompson sat in the window seat, watching the last customers reluctantly leave. The store had exceeded their sales projections, but more importantly, it had proved that their vision of a community-centered business could work. "Catherine used to say," Mr. Thompson mused, running his hand along the leather cover of his notebook, "that the best stories never really end, they just lead us to the next chapter." Looking around at what they'd created. Together, this space of books and belonging, of memories and new beginnings, Rachel understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we write together, one page, one day, one act of kindness at a time. 6 months after the grand opening, Thompson's Corner Books and Cafe had become more than just a bookstore. It had become the heart of the community. On this particular morning, Rachel stood in the window seat, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of promise, just as she had done that first day at Sunshine Diner. Mr. Thompson's notebook, now filled with countless entries, sat open beside her. But it was no longer just a record of kindness. It had become a blueprint for change. Other communities across the country had started reaching out, asking how they could recreate what had happened here in Milwaukee. The Veterans Housing Program had expanded beyond their initial plans. All 6 apartments were now occupied, with a waiting list for future openings. More importantly, the residents had become integral parts of the store's operations, each finding their own way to contribute to the community. "Morning, Rachel," Mr. Thompson called as he came down from his apartment, still wearing her father's cardigan, despite the new ones Michael had bought him. Some traditions, Rachel had learned, were too precious to change. "Big day today," she smiled, pouring his coffee. Some habits from her diner days would never fade. Indeed, it was. They were hosting their first community business workshop, sharing their model with other small business owners who wanted to integrate community service into their operations. The idea had grown from the constant inquiries they received about their success. Looking around the store, Rachel could hardly believe how far they'd come from that first morning when she'd slipped money to the cashier to cover a veteran's breakfast. The children's section upstairs buzzed with daily story times. The Veterans Corner had become a sanctuary for service members seeking connection. The cafe, under Linda's expertise, had developed its own loyal following. Alex had started college locally, balancing his studies with his role in the store's youth programs. His basketball teammates still came by regularly, now tutoring younger kids in the study area. "You know what Catherine would say about all this?" Mr. Thompson mused, settling into his usual spot. "What's that?" She always said success isn't measured by what you gain, but by what you give back. I think we've given something pretty special here. Rachel nodded, thinking of all the lives touched by their little corner of the world. The elderly veteran who'd found purpose leading military history discussions. The single mother who discovered a supportive community in their parenting book club. The shy teenager who'd blossomed running the store's social media. And it had all started with a simple choice to help someone while preserving their dignity, to see beyond circumstances to the heart of human connection. As the morning light filled the store, Rachel thought about her father, about Catherine, about all the people whose spirits lived on in the kindness they'd inspired. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures, and the most beautiful stories are the ones we write together. If this story touched your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to check out our next 2 incredible stories of kindness and transformation. They're waiting for you right here on your screen. Just click and prepare to be amazed. Until next time, remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives in ways we never imagined. Share your thoughts in the comments below with just one word describing how this story made you feel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.